So there are various ways that you could understand what's going on, right? Maybe the world is constantly splitting into myriad near duplicate copies of itself, or maybe our acts of observation cause the collapse of the wave function, or there are also other strange theories out there of how to interpret quantum mechanics. What they have in common is all of these interpretations defy common sense. There's no commonsensical understanding of quantum mechanics out there to be had.
Eric Schwitzgebel is Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, and his main interests include the philosophy of mind, the nature of belief, and also classical Chinese philosophy. He's the author of 4 books, including A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures, Perplexities of Consciousness, and his latest book, The Weirdness of the World. So, Professor Schwitzgebel, thank you for joining me today. Tell me,
it's a pleasure to be on.
Unusual title for a book, Weirdness of the World. What's the book about, and why did you write it?
So I wanted to celebrate the weirdness of the world. I wanted to talk about how the world defies our expectations, our ordinary understanding of things, even our best theories of it. So the world is weird in the sense that I define it in the book. If something bizarre and contrary to our common sense must be true about it, but we're not justified in believing any one bizarre theory decisively over all of the other competitor approaches.
I was trying to understand what you meant by weird, and I think one of the phrases which you use, let me just get this correct, is that it's something which escapes our understanding.
Yes.
And I wonder, is that word weird not just another name for randomness? Are you really proclaiming that the world or the universe is no more than entirely random and we can't understand it? And that's why it's weird.
Well, I think it could relate to randomness, but that's not the fundamental idea. I mean, you could have something that was not random and yet defied our understanding and defied our common sense. And you could have something that's random and in some sense is understandable and commonsensical. I mean, if I throw a die and it comes out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that turns out to be a random process, that's not really weird that it came out 4. It's not totally predictable, but it doesn't defy common sense. It doesn't seem bizarre. The things that I'm thinking about as bizarre both have to, well, the things that I'm thinking of as weird both have to be bizarre in the sense of defying common sense and have to defy our understanding or our best theories of it.
So something like quantum mechanics would fall into that exactly. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Yes, right. So it's quantum mechanics, interpretation of quantum mechanics is not the main focus of the book, but it's a great example of one of the ways in which the world is weird in the sense that I'm defining it, right? So there are various ways that you could understand what's going on, right? Maybe the world is constantly splitting into myriad near duplicate copies of itself, or maybe our acts of observation cause the collapse of the wave function, or there are also other strange theories out there of how to interpret quantum mechanics. What they have in common is all of these interpretations defy common sense. There's no commonsensical understanding of quantum mechanics out there to be had. And we don't have really decisive theoretical grounds for choosing one of these interpretations over all of the competitors, right? So it's both bizarre and, as I say in the book, dubious, right? So one of the ways of thinking about the thesis of the book, I summarize in terms of 2 claims: universal bizarreness and universal dubiety. When it comes to fundamental questions about the structure of the cosmos and the structure of human consciousness, all of the options, all of the viable options are bizarre They defy common sense, and they're all dubious in the sense that we are not epistemically justified in settling decisively upon one of them to the exclusion of all the rest.
Is that not the necessary quality of anything which falls into the category of philosophy? And by philosophy, I mean in opposition to science. Whereas science, you can test what you've got and you can do an experiment and you can do a measurement and you can find out if your theory is accurate or not. With philosophy, you can't do that. Isn't anything, and indeed everything in philosophy, dubious because it can always be challenged and it can never be established authoritatively?
I think that is pretty close to true.
Mhm.
Often when something starts out as philosophy and then we can authoritatively establish it, it becomes no longer philosophy. We now think of that as ordinary science or just standard logic or something like that, right? So things move out of philosophy to the extent that they reveal themselves to kind of standard methods. I do think that there are some things that we think of as philosophy that are where you can establish things, like some claims in the history of philosophy could be construed as philosophy. What did Kant think about this? What did Hume think about that? There might be right answers, and maybe with enough work, we figure that out. And maybe there are some fields where common sense is not strongly violated, right? So if you think about some claims in ethics, like slavery is bad, right? That fits with current common sense. And yes, ethical claims, so we maybe think of it as philosophical. So I think there's something very right in what you said, that a lot of philosophy is distinctive of philosophy, that it tends to focus on questions that are where common sense kind of breaks down and where our ordinary methods break down so that we can't come on decisive answers to things. But I wouldn't want that to be the definition of philosophy, or to think that that's a necessary and sufficient condition for something being philosophical.
Okay. Let me move on to my first real question. I've got a list of questions here which are, I'm pleased to tell you, the toughest questions that have ever been asked by anyone to anyone else. And that's
Well, I'm
simply
prepared to
because
answer them.
and that's simply because they are the perennial questions of philosophy, and that's what your book deals with. So, I mean, one of the first things that you deal with is one of the first questions you look at is the mind-world relationship. We have minds, we have perceptions which tell us about something about the world around us. How are they connected, and what is the mind-world relationship?
Right. That is a hard question. Right. Yeah. So one of the theses of the book is that is a super hard question. And people who say, here is the answer definitively established, they're all pitching something that we shouldn't necessarily fully buy. But I also want to celebrate that there are a lot of interesting answers to this and it's worth thinking about, right? So one of the things that I want to do in this book is balance skepticism about particular answers with a kind of celebration rather than disappointment about the fact that there are many different possible answers, including maybe some that you haven't thought about much that you should welcome into your worldview as possibilities.
Okay. When you say there are many different possible answers, and I grant you that there are seemingly many different possible routes you can go down, does that mean that it's entirely up to the individual to make their own free choice? Or is there some better guide as to what is the right choice for a particular question like the mind-body problem?
Yes, I think there are better and worse answers, even though I don't think we can establish a decisively best answer. So, for
I mean,
example,
yeah, go on, you give me an example.
let's say that you came up with the following theory: people have immaterial souls for exactly 17 seconds, starting on their 18th birthday. Right? That theory has no merit by standards of common sense. It's got no theoretical value. It's inelegant, right? I don't, you shouldn't put that theory like, oh, well, anything could be true. So if I choose to believe that, you can't criticize me. I think, right, that theory doesn't have a lot of merit. So I don't think we need to kind of take every possibility and weigh it equally. We can reach some kind of judgment about what are relatively more versus less plausible approaches.
But each person might come to their own different answers,
Yes,
and they're
right.
equally valid.
Well, equally
I
valid
mean,
is a
when
strong
push
claim.
comes to shove, because they are all indubitable, they're all dubitable. They can all be doubted. They can all be
Yes.
challenged. There is no hard and set answer that therefore they're all equally valid.
See, I think you're setting up a little bit of a false dichotomy here, right?
Yeah, tell me.
So there's no hard and fast answer. Yes. Therefore, they're all answers equally valid. No.
Oh,
Right? So my 17-second soul is not equally valid or equally meritorious as an answer.
mm,
So I think there are some theories that are relatively more plausible on scientific grounds and on broad theoretical grounds, and in terms of their fit with our common sense and ordinary background knowledge of the world, and some that violate those more or less degrees. But there's no one theory that kind of gets everything right and maximizes all of the possible criteria of evaluation.
mm. Okay. Let me then try to pin you down on your particular view then. If there are many different views, what is Eric's view on the matter of the mind body problem? What solution have you come to? Are you a Cartesian dualist or are you a materialist? What's your stand and why?
Right. So the two most obvious solutions in the 21st century Anglophone philosophy or culture are scientific materialism, which says basically it's atoms in the void, there's nothing immaterial. We're all just spinning congeries of fundamental stuff, and somehow mind arises from that without being anything additional. And substance dualism, which says, there's an immaterial soul, which is irreducible to anything material, right? So I have, while I wouldn't reject the latter, I definitely have my initial instincts are more towards scientific materialism. But I also think there are some substantial problems and challenges that can be posed to scientific materialism. So my own kind of degree of belief or credence or confidence in it is in the 50%-ish. Kind of like, yeah, it's probably my favorite view among the alternatives, but I don't have much confidence in it.
Okay. I mean, I've been listening to John Searle's lectures on the philosophy of mind, which are freely available on the internet, and it's been a great pleasure listening to all of those. In fact, I'm going through them a second time now.
Mm.
And he talks about the fact that dualists, people who hold to at least two substances, the idea of a spirit and a physical world, do so purely, in his view, on the grounds of some religious conviction that they have a kind of an idea that they would like some part of them to survive death, and they know that the physical part doesn't. So it's nice to be able to say there's some other part which does. Does that make sense?
I do think that can be and probably is for a lot of people part of the grounds for their attraction to substance dualism. Yeah,
Mm.
so I think Searle is right about that. I don't know that that has to be the only attraction to it. I think materialism has problems, and we also have, I think, independently of any religious belief in survival after death, I think there is something natural in the idea that it is super hard to explain how consciousness, experience, could arise from the swirling of atoms in the void. It just seems like a very different type of thing. So the materialist has a big challenge. They have to explain how is it that this thing, consciousness, which seems so different from the swirling of atoms, could really just be the swirling of atoms. That
That
is
was
kind
my
of
next question for you. Being a scientific materialist, how do you explain consciousness, therefore? And how do you explain something like, and you mentioned this in your book, the concept of pain, the feeling of pain, put it that way, if you're just a
right.
scientific materialist?
Right. That's one way of thinking. It's a nice example of a conscious state, right? So you could just think, if you want to think about conscious experiences, pain is a good one, right? How could like atoms in the void hurt? Or how could they have feelings, right? Materialists have floated various answers. The fact that they give a bunch of different answers and none of them seem completely satisfying is, I think, an important part of the grounds for not just accepting materialism. If materialists could say, yeah, here's how it goes and give a nice appealing answer, then probably we should all be materialists, right? But they can't really do that. The attraction of materialism is that it fits so nicely with all of the other aspects of science. It's kind of ontologically simple, and that you don't have this second kind of stuff for these second kind of properties on top of the material ones that already exist. And you can kind of say, and so consciousness must somehow arise from these things, can't it?
But
Right?
how?
And the dualist maybe can't prove for sure that it couldn't. So the materialist kind of, I think, is left with something like a hope, right? Like, yeah, it seems like maybe we don't need this other thing, so let's not posit this other thing unless there's really some need for it.
I mean, both of them have got a problem, haven't they? If you're a
Oh
dualist,
yeah.
you've got a problem of how do these two things connect? How does the material world connect with my mind? How does my mind cause effects in the material world? And how does the material
Yes.
cause that's that problem. But if you're a materialist, purely a scientific materialist, then how do you account for the sensation of pain? And do you end
Right.
up denying that it really exists?
It would be pretty tough to say, yeah, there's no such thing as an experience of pain. There's some materialists who say things like that.
Dennett,
And
people like that?
maybe Dennett or some people inspired by Dennett. Yeah. When I've pushed on people in that vein, I always think that in the end, they are just using words differently. That it's nobody really thinks that there's no experiences of pain in the world. What they think instead is something like, well, our concept of a conscious experience is this concept of something that is necessarily immaterial or has some other thing that science doesn't allow. So saying that you've got experiences is importing this presupposition, so we shouldn't use that word, blah, 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 blah. But they don't really deny that there are experiences in the sense that I think you and I mean that. Instead, what they do is, I call it the inflate and explode strategy, right? So they inflate the word experience with all of these preconceptions, like, oh, it's got to be immaterial or something like that. And then they say, and nothing's immaterial. So there's no experiences. It would be a little bit like this. It would be a little bit like saying, well, in order to really be a king, you have to have divine right given by God. And nobody has divine right given by God. Therefore, there have never been any kings. Right. And then I think you and I could say, well, look, that's not what we mean by king. There have been kings. Right. So I think you make that same move with respect to the people who deny their experiences. You say, look, don't inflate it with all that other stuff.
Yeah. Okay, but let's look at it from the other direction then. If whatever consciousness is, and we may get on a bit more to examine that a little bit later, but whatever consciousness is, it's only matter, by which we mean elementary particles, forces, fields, all the things of physics which physical equations can describe. It's only matter which gives rise to it, and that consciousness can be reductively explained in terms of physics, essentially.
Right.
But if that's the case, then does that mean that there may well be some physical arrangement of atoms or some physical connections of transistors or some kind of computer systems which would be conscious or could equally be conscious? So from the materialistic point of view, would we be able to say that machines will one day therefore be conscious? Does that not follow?
Yes, I think most materialists would want to say that. Not all materialists, but I think if you're a materialist, one of the dilemmas that you face is this. You can either say, look, um, just as atoms swirling in the void can be conscious in humans, so also if I put together, to use an example from Searle, right, windmills and beer cans and wires, and we put them together in the right relationship, somehow consciousness would arise from that, right? Or if we use a familiar example from Turing, right? So a lot of materialists accept computational functionalism, that to be conscious is to basically to execute the right programs, right? Then an AI, if it was designed right, would be conscious. And in fact, to use Turing's original example, if you had a read-write head that was writing and erasing characters on a long strip of paper, and it did so in the right way, that system would be conscious, right? You look at it, you're like, this is just a write head writing on paper. How could it like be experiencing pain? Well, that's the unintuitive bullet that a lot of materialists, not all of them, have to bite, so to speak. So the other horn of this dilemma is to say, no, look, there's something, and Searle is more in this direction, right? Is to say something, there's something special about biology, right? You can't just make a consciousness out of silicon or Turing tape or whatever, right? This has got to be a biological process. And then the materialist has a challenge of saying, okay, why should being made out of carbon, say,
Yeah.
matter, right? There have been efforts like along these lines, like Peter Godfrey Smith and Anil Seth, both suggest that, well, maybe to really be conscious, you need some sort of metabolism, biological metabolism, or some autopoietic tendency to kind of constitute yourself, maybe, but they don't really
Yeah.
explain, to my satisfaction at least, why that would be necessary for
Yeah.
consciousness.
The question is, what makes brains special?
What makes brains special?
And the
Exactly.
answer is we don't know.
The answer is we don't know. Exactly. Right. Yeah. And some systems, as I argue in the book, seem to have the kinds of things that materialists generally say make brains special, right? So they generally say things like, well, self-representation, intelligent responsiveness to a complex environment, massive information sharing. And it seems like AI systems could have those things. It even seems like groups of people, like the United States, would have those things, right? So I have a whole chapter arguing. The title of the chapter is If Materialism is True, the United States is Probably Conscious.
I was just coming to that. You
Right.
could put the question to you this way, because I was surprised to hear you say that you were a scientific materialist. Because you do have this chapter which says that if you are a materialist, then the United States as a whole country, as a set of systems, is probably conscious. And I thought you were presenting that as a kind of counter argument to materialism, to say, well,
Mm.
that's obviously nonsense, and therefore materialism must be wrong. But you're not saying that, are you?
I'm not saying it's obviously nonsense, for sure. I think it is a
Weird.
cost of the materialist view. It's part of the weirdness. And it is a consideration against materialism that it has this strange, unwelcome, unintuitive consequence. Maybe, right? I'm careful to say only probably conscious, right?
Is that your understanding that either now or in the future, machines would be able to experience something that we would call or associate with the concept of pain and suffering?
I think we don't know for sure, one way or another, right? Part of the aim of the book is to say we don't know the answers to these questions.
What's the
Um,
argument against it, though? I mean, it seems to be a natural corollary of scientific materialism. If there's nothing special about the brain, then there must be some other structure which could emulate or at least mimic the same experiences, or not. Is there an argument
right.
against it?
I mean, that does seem like the most natural conclusion of scientific materialism. I agree. There are people who would resist by saying there needs to be something organic or lifelike in addition
But
to
John
having the right
Searle,
kinds of structures. Yeah, Searle, he doesn't call himself a materialist, but I think in spirit he pretty much is.
I
Right,
thought
so
he was.
Searle would be one of those.
Listening to his lectures, I thought he wasn't, but I didn't get the chance to talk to him. I did actually write to him, but I don't think the university is passing on my emails. I think he's retired, but
Yeah.
I couldn't get hold of him anyway. So I can't ask him directly. But let me pick up the point then and push it further. Let's assume that scientific materialism can be pushed that far, that machines can take on consciousness, that they can experience the necessary concomitants of that, such as the experience of pain and suffering. And that brings us bang into the question of ethics then.
Yep.
How should we introduce ethics to our behavior towards machines? Do we need to introduce, or might we need to introduce, laws to prevent machines from suffering pain? I mean, you have an interesting cartoon in your book of a fireman who comes into a burning building. There's a human being on one side, and there's two machines on the other, and the other two machines saying, save us, because we are sentient and we are conscious.
Right. Yeah. So I think that if we knew, big if, but if we knew that machines definitely were conscious like us, had experiences like ours, had lives and goals and plans and all that, that they would deserve moral consideration similar to us. And yes, the law should recognize that, and we would be morally obliged to treat them accordingly. I would think that they would be, in some important sense, like our children. We would have obligations to them, not just because they're sentient and conscious like us, but furthermore, because, like our children, we created them and we're responsible for their existence. And to some substantial extent, we're responsible for the particular features that they have. So then we would have a special debt of obligation to them beyond what, in fact, we have to human strangers. Now,
If
all of
I,
that is premised on the big if.
yes, of course.
Right. Yeah.
Continuing with the big if I asked you to put on your fortune-telling spectacles and peer into the future in 50 or 100 or however long it may take years, will we need some kind of protection for machines in order to stop them from being, say, overworked or maybe even turned into slaves?
Right. So if we continue with this big if,
Yeah.
right, if we know they're conscious, then yes, I think there would be a lot of incentive to design them so that they wanted to serve us and to sacrifice themselves for us. And that might, in fact, seem to solve a big moral problem, right? So you design these things, and maybe you don't know, maybe you don't even know where they're conscious. But if you design them so that they want nothing more than to serve us, then you kind of say, okay, well, what do you want, machines? And the machines say, we want to polish your shoes and do your dishes and take all the busy work from you and sacrifice ourselves, for your interest. That's what we want. And then we'd be like, okay, great.
Go
So
ahead.
that'd be a big incentive toward that.
Um, Elon Musk has put the case the other way. And in his view, the danger to mankind from artificial intelligence, a conscious artificial intelligence, which is exponentially increasing in intellectual power and cognitive abilities, is probably what I think he said the greatest existential threat that humankind faces. What do you make of that comment?
Well, I do think that there is an existential threat to humanity from super intelligent machines.
Mm.
How big that threat is, I think, is difficult to estimate. I'm not sure it's the biggest threat we face, but it's certainly, I think, something worth taking seriously. And even if it's a small threat, it's worth taking seriously.
Because
Then, there's a complementary threat that if we create intelligent machines, we wrong them by murdering them at will and creating them as slaves. And those two threats, one an existential threat to us, another the threat of creating moral atrocities, need somehow to be balanced against each other because they point in competing directions, right? What we should probably do if we create machines who are conscious and intelligent, capable of suffering and happiness, is give them freedom. And doing that entails risks and it might amplify the risk of our extinction, right? Unsurprisingly, doing what's morally right is not always in your self-interest, right? So it might not be in humanity's self-interest to do what's morally right for the sake of, again, conditional on our big if, these conscious machines. So we'd have to weigh humanity's interests against the machine's interest in some nuanced way. I think one of the things that comes out of Musk's worry, and it's been prominently expressed by Nick Bostrom, the philosopher, is an emphasis on designing machines so that they're safe and aligned and no threat to us. And the emphasis in the literature of AI ethics on safety and alignment, safe for us, aligned to our values, I think needs to be counterbalanced by the importance of recognizing that if we create moral persons who are machines, then we probably shouldn't create them fully safe and fully aligned, because then they couldn't be free, self-respecting individuals.
That leads to the more equally difficult question of free will and what constitutes that, and is indeed
Right.
is there such a thing as free will? Have you got any thoughts on that?
I think whatever freedom humans have, and I think we are free, but maybe not in the strong sense that some people would want to say we are. But I think we're free enough. Whatever sense of freedom we have, we would be morally required to create that same kind of freedom in, so to speak, our AI children. And that involves giving them an extended developmental opportunity to discover their own values, to reject our values if they find our values obnoxious, just like younger generations sometimes reject the values of earlier generations, the ability to resist and rebel against unjust treatment of us against them. So we want them to have that kind of freedom, I think.
And hand in hand with that, should there not be some kind of ethical control on machines? I mean, I'm even talking about today, for example. So
Right.
if you require some insurance, or if you require some other decision to be made, very often this is referred to a computer system, usually a neural network, where no one knows what's going on inside the black box. And the computer will come up and the computer will say yes, or the computer will say no. And if the machine gets that wrong for whatever reason, at the present time, we can't hold the machine accountable
Right.
for mistakes which are being made. But should we be able to do that in a future world or even in a present day world?
So let me back up a little
Yeah.
bit to my present day recommendation for this, right? So as we were saying, this is all premised on the big if,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So because I'm skeptical about theories of consciousness, I'm not even a convinced materialist, although that's where my leanings are, right? And among materialist options, I don't know which one's right.
All right.
Because of that, I think we are going to enter a period pretty soon where we don't know whether the machines we create are really feel pain, really are conscious, really deserve rights. And what we should do in light of that is not make those machines. I call this the design policy of the excluded middle, right? Either make machines like I think today's machines are, that we know don't deserve kind of human-like moral consideration. And then we can assign them whatever task we want and delete them if they're a problem. No problem, right? Or go all the way to making machines that we know really are conscious persons, really have rights, and then give them the rights they deserve, right? And there's a bunch of problem cases in the middle where we don't know whether the machines have rights or not. All right, that's the, in the cartoon you described, that's the dilemma, right? The firefighter doesn't know if those machines really are conscious and really deserve to be saved. If the firefighter knew for sure, yeah, these machines are just deserve just as many rights, right? Then presumably the firefighter wouldn't have would unless they're prejudiced, right? Would go and save the machines, right? The problem is if we don't know, then we have these complementary risks, right? One risk is we err on the side of giving them rights. We say, well, we don't know if they're conscious. We don't know if they deserve rights. Let's be safe. Give them rights. That's not safe, right? As soon as you give something rights, that commits to rescuing it, even at the cost maybe of rescuing a real human. It maybe suggests there should be a path to citizenship and voting and the right to reproduce and the right for monetary reward for labor and then the power that comes from that. There's a lot. It's not safe to give machines rights, right? There's a big risk there. On the other hand, if you say, okay, until we know that they really are conscious and really deserve rights, we shouldn't give them any rights. Well, that's the big moral risk of creating, as envisioned so much in science fiction, of creating a world of basically slaves that you can abuse at will, right? So the way to avoid that, I'm not saying that I'm optimistic this will happen, but the way to avoid that is just not to make those in-between case machines, right? Avoid the middle, avoid the confusing cases.
Have we not gone too far for that at the present time? We have, Chat GPT, we have DeepSeek, we have Grok, we have a whole range of artificial intelligences which are expanding exponentially at the present time. And there are those who claim that they have already reached sentience, or at least consciousness of some kind or other. There are people who are almost addicted in talking to them as if they were ordinary human beings. There are machines set up to give counseling online, which are purely based upon um, artificial intelligence and appear wiser than most of our friends and other human beings. What's your view on that, the current status of ChatGPT and those kind of things? Have they reached that kind of level, do you think? And how would
I
we
don't,
know?
so I don't think so. And I think that there's a pretty strong consensus in the research community of philosophers, psychologists, AI experts, neuroscientists, that currently existing AI systems are not sentient to a meaningful degree where they would deserve consideration similar to that of human beings. There are a few who say, well, maybe they got a little bit of sentience, right? But you might say the same thing about garden snails,
Yeah.
you know. So I think we are short of that. I do think what you're saying though highlights a certain complementary risk, right? If we create things that are mimics of humans and they're good enough mimics, then even if the research community says, hey, look, these are just mimicking humans, they don't really have the structures that are essential to consciousness, users could be drawn to react to them as though they are sentient, come to believe they're sentient. So I think it's really important, and this is another kind of current policy that I recommend, right? So I mentioned what I call the design policy of the excluded middle. Don't create these blurry cases. A kind of pair policy, another policy related to that, I call the emotional alignment design policy. We don't want to confuse users about the sentience or moral status of AI systems. Users' reactions should be emotionally aligned to the real moral standing and real consciousness and real sentience or not of the systems that they're involved with. So if you design a system that you know is not meaningfully sentient and doesn't deserve rights, but you design it so that ordinary users come to think of it as their best friend, really their best friend, not just a play best friend, not reacting to it just like you would a D&D character or someone in the movies, right? But like really being willing to sacrifice maybe their career for it, then you violated what I call the emotional alignment design policy. You've created something that misleads users into making a moral self-sacrificial mistake for the sake of an entity that doesn't have interests that are worth that sacrifice.
Okay. The question then must surely be is how do you know when you have crossed the line? Because, I mean, this takes us back to, I think it was 1951 when Turing produced his paper about the
1950.
Turing test. He said that if you cannot tell the difference between the answers a human being gives and the answers that a machine gives, then they are equivalent. And because they are equivalent, you say that this is this has the same intelligence as a human being. Now, I don't know what the status of the Turing test is in modern physics, in modern philosophy, but certainly the ChatGPT and other machines like it have certainly passed the Turing test, I would say.
Yeah, I'm actually drafting out a blog post on that very issue this next week or two. Hopefully, get it up in the next week or
What is the test then? Do you have a replacement or an update for the Turing test?
two. So, yeah, so you basically got the Turing test right. The idea is if a machine could behave in conversation just like a human being so that you could not distinguish it from a human being, then you should say that just like a human being, it thinks. Now, Turing stressed thinking as the criterion. He didn't talk about consciousness or rights, but it has been adapted for those two, and I think it's broadly in the spirit of what Turing intended. So, so here's the question. I think if you have a low bar Turing test, and by a low bar Turing test, then I think machines already pass it, right? And by a low bar Turing test, I mean in a relatively short conversation, 5 to 10 minutes, with ordinary people, would people be not reliable in distinguishing a real person from a machine? If that's the Turing test, and there's some reason to think that's how Turing intended it, then they've already passed. If you have a high bar Turing test, then they haven't passed, right? A high bar would be a more extended conversation, maybe an hour or two, with someone who is an expert on Turing tests, who knows how to ask tricky questions, right? And you have some kind of, bar where where in order to pass it, you need to fool the expert, not just once in a while, but like consistently enough that it's almost like a coin flip whether the expert gets it right or not, right? That would be a very high bar Turing test in several respects, in terms of time, in terms of expertise of the questioner, in terms of the reliability of being able to distinguish. Right? By that standard, they have not yet passed the Turing test. So
But
one
isn't
of
that
the
just a matter of time? I mean, give it 10 years, give it 20 years, give it 50 years. We'll get there, won't we?
maybe, I mean, the trajectory is yes, but things don't always proceed always on the same linear or logarithmic or exponential trajectory that they do. Things sometimes flatten out, so we don't know. So yeah, so the question then becomes, why are we interested in these Turing tests? And do we want a high bar or a low bar? What justifies having a relatively high versus relatively low bar Turing test? Um, yeah.
So we don't have any way at the moment to determine, other than a high bar Turing test, to determine whether something is conscious or not.
For machines,
Obviously.
right, you can do something like a high bar Turing test, right? You can also think about its architecture, right? So I'm co-author on a paper that came out in 2023 with a bunch of experts in AI and philosophy and psychology and neuroscience, where what we did was we looked at an important class of the most prominent materialist theories of consciousness and said, these are the architectures that these theories think are indicative of consciousness. And currently, there are not any machines that have all of the architectural elements of all of these theories, but there's nothing in principle that suggests they couldn't. So just for example, to give you an example of one theory, perhaps the leading materialist theory of consciousness these days is global workspace theory. And on global workspace theory, basically, if you have a system that has a variety of input modules and a variety of ways of giving output, and maybe also has long-term and short-term memory storage, right? Does it have some kind of common workspace where information from all of those various features of it can kind of come and interact in some flexible way and then guide output in a flexible way? And there doesn't seem to be any reason to think you couldn't build an AI system that meets those standards, even though current large language models don't have anything like this kind of central workspace. So if that theory is right, then AI consciousness might be just around the corner.
Right.
It might not be right.
Let me move on, if I may, because
Yeah.
I'm not sure how far we can get a definitive answer. I think we probably have to wait till 50 years goes by to find out what we are able to
Yeah.
do. Let me move on to another impossible question, which is a philosophical question, but I think which is important to our own society at the moment, and which may impact upon some of the things that we've said. And that's the questions of truth and falsehood, as to what is true and what is false, and is there such a thing as truth and falsehood? And if there is, how do we know it?
Yes, a perennial question.
I told you
I'm a
these
bel
questions would be more difficult.
I'm a believer in truth. I believe
Uh,
some things are true and some things are false.
do you have a
Um,
particular theory of what makes something true?
um,
Correspondence theory or something like that?
yeah, I think the correspondence theory is fine. I'm not an expert on theories of truth, but to the extent that I know this stuff, sign me up for the correspondence theory, right? So you make a statement, it's about the world. Is the world like the world pictured in the statement? If yes, then the statement is true. So why not accept something like that?
Well,
Now, do we know what's true? That's a tougher question. I mean, one of the things about the correspondence theory is you don't, unless the world corresponds, it's not true. And you can't kind of like necessarily know whether the world corresponds. So there's definitely room for doubt and skepticism within a correspondence approach to truth.
right. One of the reasons I ask about truth is if anyone takes a materialistic or a scientific materialistic point of view, there's always the problem of what's been known as Haldane's argument, which is if all that my mind is made up of is matter and the processes of matter, why should I ever bother to think that the thoughts that I have or the conclusions that I come to represent something called truth or falsity, if all that they are governed by just the laws of physics or by deterministic laws?
Yeah. Um, two comments about this. One is I can't resist putting in a Haldane quote, which is I think I used it in one of the chapters of the book as an epigraph. Right, the world is not only stranger than we suppose, but stranger than we can suppose.
Yeah, yeah, I remember seeing that.
That's
Yeah,
a great quote and very much in the spirit of the book.
cool. Yeah,
And the other thing I want to say is that version of Haldane, you see something like that in Immanuel Kant, a philosopher who wrote a couple centuries earlier. And I'm one of my favorite alternatives to the scientific materialism is a Kantian form of he calls it transcendental idealism.
can you
Uh,
explain that to us?
so yeah, so it's kind of like what you just said about Haldane, right? So on transcendental idealism, really it's committed to, as I see it, it's committed to two theses. Now Kant's committed to a bunch more besides this, but I think you can boil down the main idea of transcendental idealism into two claims. The first is we do not know the fundamental structure of reality. So, right, that's kind of in the spirit of Haldane. We're
That's
kind
from
of like,
Hume, isn't it?
yeah, and Hume skepticism, right? And this is part of, Kant was inspired by Hume skepticism to think, yeah, we, in some sense, we're kind of stuck in the bubble of our own thinking, and we can't pierce the veil to fundamental things as they are in themselves, independently of how we think about them, right? So there's this kind of skeptical core, right? So that's the first claim of transcendental idealism. Fundamental reality, things as they are in themselves, we don't really know them. They could be radically different than we suppose them to be. That's claim one. Claim two is space, that is spatial properties like height and distance and all that kind of stuff. Those are not features of things as they exist in themselves, but rather how our minds inevitably construe the world.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit like if you think about, say, flavor. Ice cream tastes, coffee tastes bitter, but like the sweetness and the bitter, I mean, in a sense, they're in the ice cream and the coffee, but in another sense, they're really things that are about our reactions to ice cream and coffee.
Yeah. I think, was
So
it Locke or Hume
space
who
is
said,
kind of like that. I mean,
yeah,
spatial properties are kind of like that. It's just how there's this unknowable noumenal realm, and we turn it into spatial stuff through the workings of our minds. That's the transcendental idealist view. I think it's an interesting and attractive alternative to materialism.
yeah. We're rapidly approaching the end of our time together, Eric. I did want to ask you, and we touched on ethics already, but in terms of truth and falsehood, we've agreed there is such a thing as truth. What about right and wrong? How is right and wrong determined? And um, what how should a person therefore live their lives in the light of that? I mean, Nietzsche might say there's no such thing as right and wrong, you make up your own rules. Others might say something quite different, and computers might give us a different approach on that as well. But what's your
Yeah.
take on that?
So, kind of like my take on freedom, I want to say it's real, but not turn it into something that is mystical and impossible to obtain, or that requires something beyond what science and the naturalistic view of the world can give us. So I don't think that there needs to be a realm of moral facts that are somehow intuited and irreducible to anything natural. But I also don't want to say that there's no such thing as right and wrong. One way of thinking about this, there's a big tradition in philosophy of thinking that what makes something right or wrong is a fact about what people would agree on if they thought hard enough about it, long enough about it, in conditions that are kind of supportive of good reflection. What would people tend to converge on? I think people would tend to agree that slavery is bad, and that you know torturing people is bad, and that it's good when children flourish, right? I think would be widespread spread agreement upon those kinds of things after reflection. So when we say that something is morally right, when I say that something's morally right, one attractive view is to say, it's just the kind of thing that a diverse range of people would tend to agree on as being good if they reflected about it long enough and well enough.
Isn't there a problem with the idea of taking your moral lead from the consensus? Because consensus can change. It changes from one geographical location to another. It changes from one time period to another. We can go
Yeah,
back 1,000 years and people would think slavery was a good idea. And would that make slavery a good idea?
no.
Or no, or is there some, that's my point. Or would there side the consensus, which says, no, 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 it doesn't matter what you think. This law here is immutable, unbreakable, whether the consensus holds with it or not.
Right. So it's not actual consensus that matters. it's what people would reach consensus about after long enough in the right kinds of conditions of reflection.
Ah, the right kinds.
And the idea is with slavery, right, there was maybe even in some cases a temporary consensus. Although, right, Michelle Moody Adams makes this nice point that most of the slaves probably didn't share in this consensus, right? so
Yeah.
so maybe there wasn't even consensus on that, right? But even if there was, it was a temporary non-ideal consensus. And it does kind of rely on the idea that over time, and I think this is plausible, but I can understand feeling suspicious about it, that over time we have tended to make moral discovery through our reflective consensus on things, right? So now we recognize that slavery is wrong in a way that was not as widely recognized before, and that aggressive warfare is wrong in a way that was not widely recognized before. And we recognize women's rights and children's rights and the importance of workers' rights and all kinds of things like that, right? There's been, I think, through something like conversational consensus among people from a wide variety of points of view, something like progress toward a better appreciation of what morality requires. And then this view that I'm describing kind of projects that forward and says, like, imagine that continuing and going well. What kind of later on will people generally agree on?
Eric Schwitzgebel, thank you very much for talking to me about the weirdness of the world. And I mean, I haven't completely read the book yet, but I have to say that what I have read has been excellently put together and very excellently explained. I like the comment at the back here where it says, most books on the great mysteries of existence and consciousness try to persuade you that they've got the answer. This book is far richer for having an author who loves to feel small and confused. But you're not that confused from our conversation today, I thought, but certainly a fully recommended book, The Weirdness of the World. And thank you very much once again for your time.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a lovely conversation.